This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Rachel Johnson.
Three minutes past 8, you're listening to me, Rachel Johnson, here with you for one more hour this Sunday. Thank you for your company. Coming up in the next hour, we've got another kind of complex, difficult and triggering subject. The peg is Rebecca Joins. She's at 30. She's a math teacher, or she was. But she's been found guilty of 4 counts of sexual activity with a child and 2 counts of sexual activity with a child by a person in a position of trust, following a 2-week trial at Manchester Crown Court. She essentially had sex with 2 schoolboys. One is called Boy A, and she insisted that her relationship with a second teenager, Boy B, only began once he'd left school and she'd been fired from her job, so it was not illegal. Be that as it may, she's been found guilty on these 4 counts. You will have read into some of this story, but the reason I want to bring it up is I think it's really interesting that the question in my mind is, do we regard older women who groom and have sexual activity with children, or those under 16, through a different lens than we do men? And is it because the definition of rape is penetration with a penis? And, you know, Rebecca Joins has female anatomy. Do we regard sexual activity perpetrated by women onto men and boys as somehow less violent, less intrusive, less serious than we do when it's men upon women and girls? 0345 606 0973. I mean, contrast the Rebecca Joins case with the Jeremy Forrest trial. A teacher 10 years ago now, just over 10 years ago, Jeremy Forrest has been jailed for 5.5 years for abducting. I think that's the legal definition for when he left the country with a minor, and having sex with a 15-year-old pupil. He ran off to France. I remembered that. God, is it really 11 years ago? And he was convicted at Lewis Crown Court of child abduction and having sex with a 15-year-old pupil. Well, why aren't they calling that rape? It's all so complicated, because I thought sex with a minor was statutory rape. So, that's not in the news story I've got. Maybe somebody will be able to explain. And actually, David Greenwood, the executive officer at the Association of Child Abuse Lawyers and head of the Child Abuse Department at Svetalski Solicitors, may be able to, because he joins us now before we get to your calls, because also what I want to talk about is to what extent has the Rebecca Joins case, the female teacher, brought back any memories or any stories of you being groomed and having unwanted sexual activity or any sort of sexual activity with somebody much older at a time when you didn't really understand what was being done to you or what you were doing. I think this is what's so interesting about these cases, is that it takes people maturity to understand what has happened. It takes somebody maybe reaching the age of 30 or 40 or 50, the age of the person who abused them, to understand the disparity between them, let's say the 15-year-old, the 14-year-old, and that 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old. It's when you reach maturity and now those adult landmarks when you think, my goodness, I was a child. Is that you? 0345 606 0973. David Greenwood, sorry to keep you waiting. Thank you for joining us. Can you hear me?
Not at all. Yes, I can.
Can you just clear up this business of rape, the definition of rape? The Jeremy Forrest case, he was 30 and the pupil was 15. Why? Sorry, was that not rape?
There's an issue about consent after the age of 13, I believe, if a person... I'm not sure about the details of that case. There are all sorts of complexities to these types of offences. The Sexual Offences Act 2003 really modernised the old law on sexual offences against children, and basically allows judges to look at the whole facts of the case. The charges in this case are sexual activity with a child, and so that is quite a broad offence, and it allows a judge to weigh up all the different factors. I could go on all night about the different offences that exist between adults and children, but I won't. It is complex, and
okay, well, let's leave Jeremy Forrest aside, because I don't understand why that's not called statutory rape. But clearly, the judge may have established there was issues of consent that meant it didn't fall into that bucket. But in terms of the female teacher, the so-called inverted commas predator teacher, she's 30. She's been found guilty of 4 counts of sexual activity with a child. The sentencing hasn't taken place yet. Is it much, much rarer for an older woman to be grooming and predating, for want of a better word, younger males than it is the other way round? And is this why this is such a big story?
So I have helped thousands of people over the years come to terms with what's happened to them in childhood in terms of sexual offences against them. And yes, you're right, it is much rarer for a female to abuse a boy in their care. So yeah, it is very rare. That said, I'm not sure how much research has been done as to how many of those boys actually come forward and say something about it. We know that many girls don't. In fact, most people who have been sexually abused in childhood don't come forward. Those that do, on average, take 23 to 26 years to come forward. So
is that true? My goodness, that's extraordinary. So what I said about adulthood itself, you need to be adult to understand what happened to you as a child, was correct.
That's absolutely right. And these boys will live with it for the rest of their lives. Within their peer group, obviously their anonymity is protected, but their peer group will know who they are, and they will be known now as the boys who this happened to in their peer group. And they will be known as the boys who are fantastic at maths or physics or whatever.
They haven't been named in the reporting of the story, though, but you're saying that their cohort will know who they are. David Greenwood, can I ask you something about the kind of societal conditioning around, a 15-year-old boy with a 30-year-old woman? You can imagine people thinking, that lad, he was lucky, or, lots of boys may have been dreaming about the hot maths teacher. Do we minimise the trauma because we still believe that stereotype?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think it comes back to human nature. Human nature is that people in positions of power and authority tend to use that position for their own gratification. Sometimes it's, to get more money out of a situation. Sometimes it's to get sex out of a situation. This woman has used it to get sex out of the situation. The boy probably had limited experience of sex, and it's a dare I say, a psychological driver. It's part of our DNA to be interested in sexual activity, and these boys obviously were interested in it. They will live to regret it, no doubt.
Is that absolutely, without any doubt, I mean, that you can say that these boys, because the woman was guilty of a crime, they will live to regret it? Well, yes, of course. There's been so much publicity around this case, No, but what I'm saying is, I just playing devil's advocate with you, because I believe what I said. I think that these 15-year-olds were too young to have sex. That's why there is an age of consent. But there is also the possibility, and this is why these things are so nuanced and complicated, that they also enjoyed it, or they felt, big and strong, or like, men before their time, because this teacher had chosen them. They may not have felt like victims at the time. I agree they were, but do you understand what I'm saying? These things are, very nuanced.
I do, and I suppose it really depends on the conditioning of the boys as to how they cope with all this. If left alone, left to their own devices, they probably won't cope well with it. With some talking therapy, they can probably put this into some kind of context and build it into their life stories and, dare I say, move on to the next stage of their lives, having compartmentalised it.
Yeah, you see, I'm probably falling into the stereotype that I was calling out at the beginning, which is that I'm trying to put myself in their shoes and think, will there be a lasting trauma for them or not? And you're saying, yes, very likely they will need talking therapies. But I think that the general sense of these sorts of stories is, up until we've educated ourselves better, is, that they're lucky rather than they're unlucky. And this is why I ask whether we treat female predators, and we have a different approach to female predators than we do to male predators.
Well, if you take that point of view, I think it's a desperately sad position to take, that society thinks that these boys were lucky.
Well, it's the sort of thing you will read, or on a kind of or in a kind of thread of a laddish Twitter handle or something.
Yeah, definitely. But it doesn't scratch the surface of what's actually going on in their lives and what's going to go on in their future lives.
I agree. I mean, you probably read of Charles Spencer, Earl Spencer's autobiography, where he detailed his abuse at the hands of a matron when he was about 11 and she was about 18. And it had an absolutely devastating impact on his adult life, and to the extent that he didn't really realise how traumatic it was, and actually had to go into residential counselling in order to recover from the trauma just of writing it down in the book.
Yeah, there's a culture around machismo, and
that's the word I was looking for.
And boys and men saying, "Look, this is no problem to me. I can handle this."
Yeah.
I'm not going to break down about this. I'm not going to let it rule my life. That's something that is certainly common with men who have been abused.
Well, and women. And don't forget that it's mostly male on female abuse and violence rather than the reverse, which is why I wanted to talk about this case.
There's a lot of male on male abuse also, which is on the spectrum. It's towards the worst end, I suppose.
That's fascinating. I didn't. David, I'm so glad you came on, because that hadn't crossed my radar when I was thinking about this, as doing it as a topic. And it should be, because of course we all saw Baby Reindeer, which was very graphic, not just stalking, but also male rape, unreported as well. David, thank you very much. It's been a very helpful conversation to set up the calls, where I'm just going to hear what people's experience is, whether it's male on male, male on female, or female on male. We don't have to use your names if you don't want to. Don't have to use identifying details of any sort, just your stories. 0345 606 0973. And also, do you think, as a society, having heard my conversation with David Greenwood, we're still conditioned to think that boys who have sex are lucky rather than unlucky? You're listening to me, Rachel Johnson. It's 8:18.
This is LBC.